Kibbutzim, and I am professor of Jewish Studies at the faculty, the Graduate School of Theology, and also the director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies of the Monotheistic Religions. Thank you again for joining us for a lecture by Dr. Rina Dudai. Rina Dudai has come to Kyoto from Israel a few days ago, and when I heard that she was coming, I was very happy to welcome her to give us a lecture. Let me say a few words about her, a bit of a background. Professor Rina Dudai has studied at the Tel Aviv University for her bachelor degree in Hebrew literature and philosophy, and then also received her MA there, and her PhD is from the Hebrew University from 2001. She has dedicated much of her academic years to teaching in an educational system at the Kibbutzim seminar. She also taught for a while at the Hebrew University, and she has just retired as far as I understood, and she is right now a member at the Institute of Psychoanalysis in our times at Tel Aviv, and basically she has done her research on trauma and in relation to the Holocaust, and her book that is to be published or has already is about to be published in Hebrew is about that topic, trauma and Shoah, and it is published in Hebrew. She has published quite a lot on that topic and related stuff in modern Hebrew literature, and I believe we will be able to hear about that today in her lecture that is titled The Phantom of the Holocaust, an Interdisciplinary Discussion of Trauma. And you have in your hands the handout of the entire lecture, which will also include a movie that the Professor Dudai will interpret. So, Professor Dudai, please.
I wish to thank Professor Ada Cohen for inviting me to give this lecture, and I'm moving straight to the lecture. The lecture presents the encounter between the poetic and the psychoanalytic language, showing how the poetic language can deal with trauma and its memory. The poetic language has a unique ability to precede verbal language in latent traumatic experience, extracting the memory of trauma from the invisible. The analysis will be illustrated by analyzing the movie Ida, demonstrating the ways by which the translation of trauma into poetic language brings forth the unconscious, inaccessible workings of the mind. In this lecture, I wish to address the encounter between poetic language and psychoanalytic discourse by following the ways in which poetic language deals with the shattering experience of trauma and its memory. It is a language that speaks in reduction, to the extent of silence, in fragments, and in repetitiveness. By these very means of caesura, of visual disappearance and voicelessness, poetic language provides us access into deep, hidden layers of the human mind. Historically speaking, it was Pierre Janet who first claimed that in especially traumatic situations, memories are stored as fragments, thus blocking the possibility of extracting them under normal conditions. According to Janet, the experience of trauma cannot be assimilated and integrated into existent mental frameworks and remains instead disconnected from them. Later on, the traumatic memory returns as an intrusion that is experienced as a fragmentary sensation. In 1926, Freud defined the memory of trauma in his essay, Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, as a memory of action rather than a verbal memory. Trauma is present as a silent action, lacking symbolization and integration. Laplanche and Pointillis define trauma as an event in the life of an individual that is characterized by its potency, by the individual's inability to properly react to the event, and by an internal turmoil that has a long-term influence on the individual's inner life. In many cases, trauma incorporates an odd paradox. At the time the trauma occurs, there is no extreme emotional reaction, nothing that seems to leave an imprint on the mind. In place of this, a void opens up, a large empty space, as the traumatic experience is registered, noted but stored as a latent, postponed memory that received its full validity only in different time and place. The event is fixed and sealed in the mind with no connection whatsoever to consciousness, and from this dark place it produces symptoms that indicate its traces but do not expose it. The traumatic event is then established by means of an additional event that activates the first one, bringing it out of its latency and validating it. The Freudian term in retrospect, Nachträglichkeit, relates to the second event that retrospectively validates the trauma. Between these two events, the trauma is concealed in a state of repression. Katie Carruth went on to substitute the term inherent latency for Freud's term repression in order to emphasize the act of postponement, the delaying in the traumatic event. Ruth Leith added the dimension of the present tense to the experience of traumatic memory in her claim that trauma refuses to be represented as past, existing in an eternal present. The length of the delay between the experience of a catastrophic event and its recognition as such can take decades, but this oblivion found between the two events nevertheless finds a way to exist, speaking through symptoms as a presence that cannot be defined. Common to all these varying perceptions of trauma is the observation that the experience cannot be represented, at least not as a conscious verbal memory. Wilfred Bion refers to these hidden mental components as B elements and claim they are connected to a sensual experience that serves as a trace for their existence. according to Bion, B elements are thoughts with no thinker. The traumatic experience is an encounter with the incomprehensible, which results in terror, helplessness, and muteness. In The Drowned and the Saved, Primo Levi wrote that, quote, "Those who have seen the face of the Gorgon did not return, or returned speechless." The story of the surviving witness is haunted by the chaotic story of the trauma sealed in the abyss of oblivion. Dominique Lacapra uses the concept of access in relation to extreme traumatic events. At the heart of the traumatic experience, claims Lacapra, there is an access that evades all forms of representation and makes present the trauma precisely by its inability to be verbalized. What is the status of this axis that cannot be expressed and evades representation? I skip three lines. One of my key questions is, therefore, in dealing with the phenomenon of latent trauma, is how can unconscious, unconsolidated material be, if at all, represented? How can a memory with no rememberer, following the spirit of Bion's concept, thoughts with no thinker, be expressed? I claim that this is precisely the power of poetic language in general and the language of film in particular. It is able to make present, to revive the event that refuses to come into the light one bit or stroke before it is represented verbally as a memory. By analyzing in close observation the movie Ida, I will demonstrate the ways in which the translation of trauma into poetic language manages to bring forth the unconscious, inaccessible workings of the mind. The film Ida was released in 2013 and directed by Paweł Pawlikowski. It takes place in Poland in the early 1960s and tells the story of a young woman living in a convent who, just as she is on the verge of taking her vows to Christ, discovers the details of her own past. She learns that during the Second World War, when she was a baby, her Jewish parents were murdered by Poles who were supposed to be hiding them from the Nazis. The Poles also killed Ida's cousin, who had been hiding with Ida and her parents, but they had only mercy on her. Anna/Ida was sent as an orphaned baby to the convent, where she was brought up until the moment when the film begins. The film follows Anna/Ida's journey as she searches for traces of her past and her identity. The opening scene lays before us scenes from life in the convent as the camera wanders from its study rooms to the courtyard, from the mess hall to the room of the Mother Superior of the convent. The film, shot in black and white, plunges the viewer into a unique atmosphere from the outset. It starts with a still frame of black, zero visual and zero audio, gradually fading into light and sound. Here begins the fine, delicate tapestry work of weaving the image, the sound, and the narrative together. working. Please take note of the soundtrack and the visual editing. The most dominant elements of the opening scene is its fragmentary editing, which breaks apart the continuity of the images and creates a state of orientation. The entire scene includes 22 fragments, creating caesura in the storyline that break the scenes up into shards, requiring us to take time to reorganize the pieces into a coherent whole. Some of the shots are done from an especially low angle, looking up, creating large area of empty space within the frame, a type of visual absence parallel to the lacuna that characterizes trauma, which I mentioned earlier.
Nazywa się Wanda Gruz, jest siostry ciotką. Pisałyśmy do niej wiele razy, prosiłyśmy ją, żeby po siostrę przyjechała, ale nigdy tego nie zrobiła.
Może nie dostała tych listów?
Dostała, to w końcu odpisała, że nie może przyjechać. Powinna ją siostra poznać, zanim złoży śluby. To jest jedyna siostra krewna.
To koniecznie tego powodu.
Tak. Pojedziesz do niej, zostaniesz tam tak długo, jak to będzie potrzebne.
In each segment of the 22 fragments that make up the first scene, the camera is static, which is important as comparison to the end of the movie. Whatever enters the frame exists. Whatever is beyond the frame is in the realm of the unconscious. The process we will witness as the film unfolds is the transformation into consciousness. Despite the fact that the camera is static, there is nevertheless movement within the frame, which changes direction according to the angle of the shot. The characters cross the frame diagonally from right to left. They are shot from above, from below, from the side, from the front of the back and the back. The sharp changes in the angle of the camera contribute even further to the fragmentary impression of the scene. Through these cinematic devices, the sense of suppressed traumatic memory is present from the very start of the film, present but at the same time absent, present in the cuts, in the silences, in the splits and rifts, and expressed in the shots that leave vast areas of the frame empty. By means of these devices, the viewer are already positioned as witnesses to the poetic representation of a trauma of which Ida, who at this point is still Anna, still knows nothing. One couldn't choose a more powerful evocation of the muteness of trauma. Ida is at this point in a state of utter disconnectedness from her childhood memory, a memory she will only be able to reconstruct by means of her Aunt Wanda later on. Meanwhile, what is present is the absence itself, the void rumbling beneath the surface, the memory's access murmuring in the unconscious speaks only through the atmosphere created. If we listen to the soundtrack reveals the silent, intimate action of a nun drawing the facial feature of Jesus Christ where the movie is starting. Only after so much screen time has passed that we start thinking there might be something wrong with the movie, do we hear the sound of clothes being shaken, preparing to cover the sculpture. Then come the sounds of the footsteps, the frightened cackles of hens, sounds of forks and knives on the ceramic plates. Our first encounter with a human voice is the whispers of prayer. And only towards the end of the long scene do we witness actual dialogue, a conversation between Anna and the Mother Superior of the convent that sets the plot in motion. The evasive atmosphere of the opening scene, which speaks in silences, fragmentary pictures, and jarred transitions, eventually consolidates in the encounter between the Mother Superior and Anna/Ida. The nun's sharp tones invade the preceding shot, gathering together the broken voices to reveal the information that sets the story in motion. Anna, who has spent her entire life in the convent as an orphan, discovers that she has an aunt in Lodz and is ordered by the Mother Superior to travel to meet her in order to discover her hidden past before taking her vows. It is the Mother Superior of the convent, not Anna/Ida or her Aunt Wanda, who initiate the task of unearthing the traumatic memory. But this memory is still raw, amorphous, a stage before its crystallization. The Mother Superior is the cause external to the subject, that sets off the narrative. She is the one who sets the wheels in motion for the search that sends Anna/Ida to meet with her Aunt Wanda. In trauma stories, pay attention to this, it is always an external cause that puts in motion a process that lies in wait to reveal itself. The Mother Superior does not tell Anna anything about her Jewish roots. She just sends her to her aunt, exposing just the tip of the iceberg that leads Anna toward her past, leaving her to make her own way into a story entirely different from the one with which she had been familiar until then. One could conceive of the head nun as a character that represents the conflict between Judaism and Christianity, or between the Jews and the Poles. Even the story, even the very fact that the character is the mother superior of the convent, a surrogate for a real mother and an echo of the disruption of the primal dyad, is heavily laid with symbolism. In the context of this lecture, however, I would prefer to set aside these interpretive possibilities, to empty ourselves of them for a moment, in order to recognize the fact that a trauma is always first accessed by the other. It is the other that opens the first window onto the journey that all at once transforms the protagonist. By the end of the film, Ida is changed. She will no longer be the subject we meet at the beginning of the film. The opening scene ends with Ada/Ida's exit from the convent, with a shot of the building facade, we see it here, in the background. This will be the same image to which Ida returns after seemingly completing the journey of discovery by finding her parents' skeletons and burying them properly in the Jewish cemetery in Lublin. The film moves in spirals, each rotation reaching closure but opening a window somewhere else. 18-year-old Ida leaving the convent for the first time is a living trace of the trauma of which she knows nothing at this stage. The traumatic event that seems never to have been experienced, that has disappeared into the abyss of oblivion before having been processed, is preparing to resurface, imbued with the possibility of amendment. Ida is thrust out of the convent, her sheltered place of certainty and security, and into the heart of the big city lodge. She takes the train and wanders the streets of the city towards the first discovery, that of her Jewish identity. The discovery is made gradually via her movement through the entrance spaces of her Aunt Wanda apartment. Ada/Ida enters the building foyer and from there climbs up the spiral staircase until she reaches her aunt's doorway. When she opens the door, Wanda already knows the identity of the young woman standing before her, as if she has stood on the other side of the door for many years, waiting for this moment.
Pani Wanda Gruz? Jestem pani siostrze. Dlaczego nie przyjechała pani po mnie do sierocińca?
Nie mogłam, nie chciałam. Nie było ci za mną dobrze. Więc jesteś żydowską zakonnicą. To jest Róża. A to jesteś ty.
Róża była artystką, a ja lubiłam przygody. Bardzo się różniłyśmy. Ona ciągle coś majstrowała z jakichś szmatek, szkieły. Raz na przykład zrobiła witraż i wstawiła go w oborze, żeby krowom było weselej. A to jest twój ojciec. Mnie ciekawy taki prymityw. Nie lubiłam go. Cały ich klan był stamtąd, choćby był z Rina. Przez niego Róża wylądowała w tamtej dziurze. Ty musisz cały czas siedzieć w tym kapturze? Też pewnie jesteś ruda, co? Mama brata? Nie, byłaś jedyneczką.
Jutro pojadę do Piasku. Chcę odwiedzić groby rodziców.
Oni nie mają grobów. Ani oni, ani inni Żydzi. Nie wiadomo, gdzie są pochowani. Może pod lasem, może w jeziorze.
Zapytam ludzi.
A co będzie, jeśli tam pojedziesz i się okaże, że nie ma Boga? Bóg jest wszędzie, to wie. Zawiozę cię tam, pojedziemy razem.
Wanda informs Anna/Ida directly, without a hint, without a hint of compassion, that she is a Jewish nun. A paradox that Anna/Ida does not understand at first and cannot relate to. Only after a long questioning gaze that Anna/Ida directs at Wanda does the latter explain that she is Jewish, adding that her real name is Ida Levinstein, daughter of Rosa Hertz and Chaim Levinstein. All at once, Ida Levinstein is thrust into the context of an entirely different life, and her fragmented biography begins to fill with details that construct a new narrative. You were born in Piaski, near Lomza, her aunt tells her, as Ida is still grappling with the new information. Wanda lays on the table a photograph of her as a baby in her mother's arm. Wanda's fingers hold onto the photograph tightly, as if through touch she is transferring the historical trauma to the here and now of the story. These photographs are the main strategy used by the film to portray the family roots that lead towards Ida's Jewish origins. On the issue of photography, Susan Sontag says that, quote, a photograph is not only an image as a painting is an image, an interpretation of the real. A photograph is a trace, something directly stenciled off the real, like a footprint or a desk mask. Photography, claims Sontag, springs from the original, from the concrete thing itself. At the same time, despite the concreteness, the photograph is the most vivid evidence of the original's absence. Ronald Barthes ties together the photo and the original even more tightly, conceiving of the photo as indivisible from the original. The photograph as a site of memory is not just a stimulus for the evocation of the traumatic memory. It is also the site of the constructed presence of the traumatic memory. The act of identification becomes an act of reconstruction, of making present the fragments of the traumatic core. Wanda lays before Ida a series of photographs, photos of those most dear to her, whom she will never be able to meet again, making present that which is absent. The photographs will force upon the viewer the pain of this absence. We will now move to the second discovery, the fate of the victims, Ida's parents and Wanda's sons. In this series of scenes, we follow Wanda and Ida on their search for the murderers of Ida's parents and Wanda's sons in order to find their burial site. Wanda tells Ida that during the war she left her son with her sister in order to join the fighting. As she speaks, it seems she sees her participation in the war as meaningless and is left only with the guilt of abandoning her child to his death. Wanda copes with her pain via her addiction to casual sex and drinking, but when Ida appears at her doorstep, Wanda agrees to join her on her quest for the truth about their loved ones. While Wanda's lead the way and driving force behind the journey is Ida, it is thanks to her that the two embark on the discovery of the traumatic event, which at this point in this movie is still largely unknown. During their search, we are also able to observe the murderer's mechanism of denial. At this stage, it is the victims, Ida and Wanda, who are pushing back against the denial of the past. They don't give up despite the stubborn walls of silence they run into while uncovering the truth. The spaces of the film are given a prominent role in the representation of this process of excavation.
Nie, skiło się. Róża i Heil Lebenstein.
Pani, nas Żydów to było ogromne. I akurat nie znam przykro.
Dlaczego przykro?
Jezu, nie wiem. Przykro, bo przykro zawsze mówię.
A pan je znał? I jeszcze jeden. I rachunek. Tam kiedyś mieszkała nasza rodzina.
Które mieszkali sobie Żydzi.
A ja nie wiem, czy to wszystko.
To mój dom i moja ziemia.
Oboje wiemy, do kogo należy ten dom. Twój ojciec ukrywał rodzinę Lebensteinów. Gdzie? Gdzie? W lesie, w szałasie? Przecież ja dobrze wiem, kto to nosił, a kto pomagał Żydom.
Ojciec nigdy nie poszedł do Niemca.
Wiem. Jak skinęli? Szymon Skiba, twój ojciec, gdzie jest?
Nie wiem.
Ja czuję, jak ktoś kłamie. Ojciec
The scene in the entrance hallway that leads to Vanda's house, where Ida discovers the truth about her past, is echoed in another entrance, that of the house where the family of the murderer, Shimon Skova, lives. The foyer serves as another doorway, opening into the past, leading the two women towards the discovery of what happened. Although the way to the truth is paved with setbacks and difficulties, the man who was responsible for providing refuge to their family is not at home, but in the hospital. The hospital scene is especially poignant. Dialogue is sparse and fragmentary. There are lengthy silences between the words. Bodily gestures speak. The fracture of the fragments, the shattered pieces, are present in the poetic language as an axis rolling down the past. At this stage, the murderers adamantly resist revealing the truth and are unwillingly dragged into the revelation by the victims themselves.
Dobrze, że mówię. Ukrywają mi w lesie. Karolina.
With the discovery of the pit, with the discovery of the pit in which the skeletons are found, the final secret of the story is revealed by the murderer himself. It was the son, not the father, who killed the family. This revelation does not evoke any desire in the women for revenge, instead giving them a certain sense of closure, at least momentarily. Ida and Wanda gather the bones of their loved ones and take them to be buried in the Jewish cemetery in Lublin. Seemingly, this is the ending of the closure of the journey. Wanda brings Ida back to the convent, and with the building's familiar facade in the background, they say goodbye. With this scene, the image of the convent becomes part of the film's grammar, its recurring punctuation, and we are led to expect the film to end.
Przyjedziesz na moje śluby?
Nie, ale wypiję twoje zdrowie. Szkoda, że już nie może cię zobaczyć.
Pawlikowski could have ended the film once the journey arrived full circle. The victims have been properly buried in the Jewish cemetery in Lublin, and Ida and Wanda return each to their previous life. This type of ending would have provided closure and a source of consolation. The ghost of the past can finally be put to rest, and life can go on. The film, however, does not end thus. Despite the narrative closure, the ghosts carry on their incessant murmuring, and the unspoken excess continues to cause turmoil. From this point onward, the past of the two protagonists diverge. Although Wanda brings Ida back to the convent to resume her path as a nun, Ida is unable to wholeheartedly take her vows to Christ and ends up delaying them. Meanwhile, Wanda, now that she has allowed the truth of the tragedy to come into the light out of the darkness of oblivion, can no longer find respite in denial. In Wanda's last scene, we see her in her apartment, playing the same record she put on when Ida first came to visit. Mozart's Symphony number 41 in C major, his last symphony, also known as the Jupiter, after his death. Turning up the volume, she walks restlessly around the room and then jumps to her desk. Ida plays the same music too, when she comes to Vanda's apartment immediately after her death and literally steps into her aunt's shoes. Wearing her clothes, she drinks to the sound of the symphony, becomes entangled in the curtain. Here a potent metaphor for the mental entrapment in trauma. Ida envelopes herself in the curtain, turning round and round until she's stripped and falls. This is an astonishingly accurate visual representation for the type of the centripetal pull that draws the subject into the vertex of the trauma. Michael Bakhtin coined two interesting terms that found their way into the discourse of trauma: centripetal and centrifugal. In processing trauma, acting out is a centripetal form of coping in which the force of the vertex pulls the subject inward, drawing him or her. In contrast, working through trauma is a form of centrifugal movement in which the spiraling action throws the subject outwards, extricating him or her from the danger around him outside. Thinking in these terms, we can claim that Vanda's processing was centripetal, as was Ida's act of stepping into Vanda's shoes after her aunt's suicide. The metaphor of Ida's entrapment in the curtain is a powerful metaphor for the merciless and snaring power of trauma, a force that draws her into a black hole, into the inner void in Vanda's apartment. Towards the end of the movie, Ida turns her back on the option of opening a window of a new life, closing instead the return to the convent. The return to the convent seems certain. In the film's closing scene, we can see now that the camera is not static. It moves alongside Ida as she strides down the path, murmuring to herself as if signifying something kind of revival in preparation for her return to the convent. Listen to the music. This music that accompanies this scene is Ich rufe dich zu dir, Herr Jesus Christ, BWV 639 by Bach, a piece that emphasized the call to Christ and devotion to the love of God, thus declaring a form of trauma processing. The choice the director made in the musical score is the piano adaptation of Bach rather than the original score played on the organ. The piano adaptation. No, אחד קודם. לא, אחד קודם. This is the original work by Bach. And what we heard before was the adaptation by piano. The piano adaptation of Bach turns away from an adherence to the Christian religious institution for which the work was written and leaves only a vague sense of religiosity, highlighting the ending's ambiguity. This is the first time the director decides to use a soundtrack external to the narrative, which does not have a diegetic explanation within the text. Until this point, the film soundtrack was anchored in the reality of the story, whether it was dialogue, musical instruments playing, or music heard from a gramophone. The ex-territory of the music in this scene serves a sense of religiosity, but the piano adaptation, not the original one, the presence of a transcendental being from beyond. Well, I stop here. This is the end of the movie. And the main question, which I think it's a crucial question of the film, and I wish to emphasize it, is where Ida is heading toward in the last scene of the film. You have noticed it. The determined return to the convent seems certain because Ida wears the clothes of the convent. Yet, we never see her actually reaching it. We, the viewers, have already become familiar with this landscape. And in our imagination, we see Ida arriving at the convent, this time as a conscious choice with which she has come to terms. Indeed, when people are asked what they remember as the last scene of the film, most people are willing to swear that the film ends with the convent facade and Ida's second return. The director, however, decides to end on a different note. He leaves Ida in motion, striding down the path resolutely and us along with her. The ending of the film leaves us with many possible, at times contradictory interpretations. There are, I believe, two competing directions at play here, leaving the viewer to decide which way Ida will end up taking. She seems determined, full of life, but we cannot be sure whether she has chosen the path leading to the ghost of her ancestors or the path leading towards the convent, a total devotion to the love of God alongside a detachment from this world. Or perhaps there is a third option. The director, which I believe, takes leave of her walking down the path itself in a state of wandering, led by an endless drive for the search itself rather than any clear direction. Her apparent determination could, in light of this interpretation, be an expression of her inner upheaval rather than a final choice. The fact that the director refuses to provide us with the certainty that the film has prepared us to expect the anticipated closure for the narrative that would have been supplied by ending with the convent facade is meaningful. Moreover, either walking down the path, no convent in sight, to the sound of sacred music, with only the echoes of an organ, alongside echoes of phantoms of the past walking down their own path, this image lingers, troubling us even after the projector darkens, the curtain closes, and the lights are turned on. This is poetic attentiveness, preceding the conscious rumbling throughout the movie and enabling us to sense, touch, and maybe even get a glimpse of something unnameable until blindness strike again. I wish to finish this lecture with a quote of part of Celan's poem, Speak You Too. Speak you too, speak as the last, say out your say. Speak, but don't split off no from yes. Give your say these meanings too. Give it the shadow. Give it shadow enough. Give it as much as you see spread round you from midnight to midday and midnight. Look around, see how things all come alive. By this, alive, speaks true, who speaks shadow.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to continue in a sense. Thank you very much. And we have time until 6:10, and of course we are very happy to open the floor for questions. I think we are coming to time, so I would like us to close down here. Thank you very much, Dr. Rina Dudai, and I hope you will join us in future SISMOR seminars and SISMOR activities. Please follow us up on the website. We'll be very happy to see you. Thank you very, very much. And thank you.